Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Winecast. For this cast, I'm covering a region that's just emerging on the international wine stage, but whose wines and wine culture are rich and intriguing: Israel. It should come as no surprise for a region situated at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, not far from the cradle of winemaking in the Middle East. Viticulture in the land variously called Canaan, Israel, and Palestine goes back several thousand years, but the accidents of history, including a long period of Muslim control that frowned on the production of alcohol, combined to leave few traces of ancient indigenous grape varieties. Though there are currently research efforts underway in Israel to identify some of these grapes, and even occasional efforts by producers to bottle wine made from them, Israel's modern wine industry is based on international varietals, whose arrival in the area is connected to the region's modern history. Though a winery was established in 1848 under the supervision of a local rabbi, it didn't last long, and the modern industry didn't begin in earnest in a permanent way until the 1880s, when the Baron Edmund de Rothschild, a member of a very important Jewish family in France and the proprietor of Chateau Lafite Rothschild in Bordeaux, visited the area then known as Palestine and agreed to help finance the establishment of the Carmel Winery, a winery that remains in operation today and is currently Israel's largest. It would be this same winery that around 80 years later would also produce Israel's first dry table wine, and that would start producing Israel's first quality varietal bottlings about a decade after that. What was being produced before the first dry and varietal bottles? Mostly wines meant primarily for religious purposes, though they were certainly consumed outside of a religious setting, and that were at least a little sweet in character, since there's a long tradition in Judaism of marking the Sabbath and other holidays with sweet wines. Though it came late to Israel, dry wine production caught on and was the first step on a path toward a focus on quality production in Israeli wine that would hit full stride during the 1980s. Where has that path toward quality production led? Quite far, actually, and today there are over 300 wineries in Israel, around 85% of which would fit the description of a boutique or quality-minded but small-volume producer. There are large producers in Israel, though, with the majority of production, about 75%, coming from the country's 5 biggest wineries. Yearly production overall in Israel is about 3 million cases, a modest amount by international standards, and about 63% of that is dry red wine, while dry white wines make up another 16% of total production, with the remainder taken up by sweet and then sparkling wines, and finally by a very small amount, about 2% of total, rosé production. The top 5 varieties planted are all red and, thanks to the influence of the Baron de Rothschild, are dominated by Bordeaux varietals, with Cabernet Sauvignon coming in first, followed by the southern French-Spanish heritage grape Carignan that figures prominently in bulk wine production, Merlot, Syrah, and Petit Verdot. Though less widely grown, whites are important too, with Muscat of Alexandria and French Colombard figuring in sweet and bulk production respectively, while Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc are more important to quality production. Israel is also an important place for plantings of Petit Syrah or Durif, and that grape ranks as Israel's 11th most planted grape. Israel generally has a warm Mediterranean climate, and that should be no surprise given both its location on the Mediterranean and how far south it is, with most of its growing regions falling between the 33rd and 32nd parallels north, about where San Diego, California, and Mexico's Guadalupe Valley are, respectively, putting it close to the very southern end of the range where it's usually considered optimal to grow grapes in the northern hemisphere. There are currently 5 designated growing regions in Israel, and the northmost 4 of them have at least a few sub-regions each. The main growing regions are Shomron, the location of the earliest plantings by Jewish settlers in Palestine; Galil, or in English, Galilee, which is the area with the most land under vine, including plantings in the contested Golan Heights area; Shimshon, a loosely defined area between the Judean foothills and the coastal plain that, fun fact, is named after the biblical hero Samson because the stories about him in the book of Judges are all set in this area; the Judean hills, an area around the capital Jerusalem that includes plantings in the Palestinian territories; and finally the Negev, a desert region in Israel's south with a very arid climate that drifts toward the continental end of things and that is very sparsely planted and has, as yet, no subregions. Please note that the map I use to illustrate these regions is not a map of those regions, just a map of Israel's geography in general. These wine regions were first designated in the 1960s, with the last official map demarcating them drawn up in 1977, and since then land has been planted that isn't strictly within each of them, but that is treated like it is and might as well be in terms of terroir, so the whole system is in very serious need of another look and of a redrawing of the map. Israel is like many New World producers, in fact, spiritually at least, it is a New World producer, in that there is very little regulation of vineyard and winemaking practice, with growers and producers generally being free to plant what grapes they see fit and to make the kind of wine from them that they want. Israel does follow an 85% rule for place of origin labeling, so if a region or sub-region is on the label, 85% of the wine in the bottle was made from grapes from that area. And the same 85% threshold applies for single varietal labeling as well. I found one source that claimed that if a varietally labeled wine contained more than 85% of the named varietal but not a full 100%, then at least the next most used varietal was required to appear on the back label. I wasn't able to verify if in fact this is the law, but I did see at least one bottle that followed this protocol. You can't really talk about the Israeli wine industry without at least saying a word or two about kosher wine. And since kosher wine is a pretty complicated subject, there's more than a word or two to say about it. Fortunately, I've already covered the subject in lots of detail in a dedicated cast that you can check out if you want to. So for the purposes of this cast, I can get away with just a few quick observations about the role that kosher winemaking plays in the Israeli industry. First, to be absolutely clear, there's no legal requirement in Israel for winemakers to make their wines kosher. And in fact, a majority of Israel's 300-plus wineries don't make kosher wine, but a very big majority of Israel's wine output, perhaps as much as 90%, is kosher, because all of the big commercial wineries and a fair number of the small boutique wineries do opt to make their wines this way. That might be a surprise given the well-known fact that most of Israel's Jewish population is secular rather than religious in its orientation, and that traditional religious observance is not necessarily high on the agenda for many Israeli Jews. Nevertheless, for reasons too complicated to go into here, there's a strong consumer expectation, even among secular Jews, for kosher wine, particularly to celebrate the Sabbath and to mark holidays and other religious observances. What's involved in making a kosher versus a non-kosher wine? Well, it involves hiring a traditionally observant religious authority called a mashgiach to provide hashgacha, or oversight, to the winemaking process to make sure that the wine isn't handled in such a way that would compromise its naturally kosher status. Additionally, if the winemaker isn't a traditionally Sabbath-observant Jew himself or herself, he or she can't come in direct contact with the wine while it's in vat or barrel, having to have samples of it for evaluation, say, brought to him or her by an observant worker, and so personnel hired to work in the winery will also need to be traditionally observant. These requirements add expense to the wine, and many secular or at least not traditionally observant Israeli winemakers have chafed under this expense, as well as under requirements like having to avoid direct contact with their wine and barrels. Before ending this cast, I want to fulfill a viewer request to mention a uniquely Israeli, though not very ancient grape, Argaman. Argaman was the result of an intentional crossing in the 20th century of Carignan and the Portuguese grape Susau that was developed specifically to add deep color to wines it was blended into, something it does very well, adding a rich reddish purple hue, per its name that means purple or magenta in Hebrew. Argaman is Israel's 8th most planted grape, but so far its main role in the wine industry has been in inexpensive jug wine and other economy formats, usually blended along with its parent, Carignan. Still, some Israeli producers, particularly in the Galilee region, have high hopes for it and have been experimenting with varietal bottlings. I haven't tried varietal Argaman, it's hard to find even in Israel, and the few people I've talked to that haven't been enthusiastic, but it's worth remembering that the wine world is full of surprises, so who knows what the future holds. So, looking to try some Israeli wines and don't know where to start? Well, I'll make it easy for you since they aren't widely available outside of Israel or metropolitan areas with large Jewish populations like New York, Los Angeles, and South Florida, and a few other places in Canada, France, and the UK. If you're not in one of those places, try whatever you can find, with the good news being that many wine shops, large and small, will have at least one kosher offering, and the chances are good that the bottle will be from Israel. If you do have more options, then be on the lookout for whites like Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc from the Galil region in the north, where the relatively high elevation of vineyard sites helps with growing white grapes in an otherwise very warm climate. Cab Sauv does well throughout Israel, though maybe not so much in the Negev. So do give Israeli cabs a try, and don't be too surprised if they feel a lot like cabs from some of the warmer areas of California. The Judean hills have gained a reputation not just for Cab Sauv, but for other Bordeaux varieties and for making those into Bordeaux-style blends. And while I don't usually mention individual producers, Domaine du Castel is something of a benchmark producer both for this style and this region, and for Israel as a whole. But in my opinion, the real hookup for Israeli wines is to be on the lookout for those grapes that do well in regions with a similar climate to Israel, regions like you'll find in Spain, southern France, and Italy. So if you can spot Israeli wine made from varieties grown in those areas, jump on it. Also, I have yet to have a bad Israeli rosé, and while I'll be the first to admit I haven't sampled anywhere near exhaustively, I think there's a real future for rosé in Israel, and I try every single bottle that I can find. Thanks for joining me for another Winecast. I'm hoping to continue releasing new casts every week, but as I begin buckling down on my studies, I'm realizing that things may get spotty every now and then. But hopefully what I learn about Italian wine and can then share with you will be worth the occasional late cast. If this cast was helpful and enjoyable to you, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and please always feel welcome to leave a comment or question. I'm your host, the Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. Smach ba'inav, aval tamid b'midah.